This is Prairie Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT, Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board, and today is Sunday, as it always is for the Prairie Monk Show. This is April the 1st, and it happens to be Easter. And let's see, this is the Prairie Monk program, WEFT's weekly look at conservation, rails, trails. The greenways are actually green for the moment, but I hear that by the time I'm bicycling home this afternoon, it's likely to be white out there. Oh, joy, oh, joy. And whatever else Dave has on his agenda for today. And we have Britta here with us today. That means we would really, really, really dearly love for you to give us a call and make a pledge here at 217-359-9338, because it's not just Dave and I here today. Britta is here, and she, I'm sure, will be happy. I'm not lying, am I? No. She'll be happy to take your phone call. So please, we would love to get a couple of phone calls before this hour is over. 217-359-9338.
This is Pledge Drive, and we really utilize this program in more than one sense. We videotape it, put it on Banner Public Television twice a week, put it up to YouTube, and then we make links out of it if we can. We drop pictures into the program. David does a lot of work to get that together and teaches me how to do it with limitations. And the facility that WEF provides for people to come in and present their own cases, to play wonderful music with people who know what their genre is about, and to explain it to others, to have community events that WEFT people go to. It all is very, very helpful. And if we could encourage you to contribute to that cause, I know some of you have done that for years and years, but others need to step in too. It's really very important to get messages out. Today we'll be talking about a field trip to prairie areas that are not easy to get to or to work with. And we'll be putting in maps and charts that will help you understand the territory. We'll talk a little bit about the pocket prairie across the way. All those things help you understand what is going on right here in Market Street. There's going to be a poor tap room bar and just across the road, and our little pocket prairie will be outdoor restaurant tables, but we're hoping that there might be a little bit of the pocket prairie remain. So we're lining up with the Boneyard Festival to get you to provide some ideas about how we might go about preserving some of the pocket prairie. All those things come together with a WEFT, and there's a family involved. You have a lot of people that come together and know each other, and that is all contributory to keeping WEFT on the air. We don't have any formal paid professionals on board anymore. We're doing it by volunteers, and that's not always easy. So David might like to have some comment on this sort of thing.
Yes, thanks. For quite a few years, I was on the air here, and when I first got my own show, I came on Saturday evenings at 8 p.m. I was on after the Old Timer, if you remember the Old Time Country Jamboree. And he loved to tell his audience, folks, you have to call me on my program because if I don't get enough pledges, they're going to take me off the air. That was never the case. It didn't matter. He still got zillions of pledges. And the most important thing to remember is what you're doing when you make a pledge to WEFT is you're keeping the station on the air. And by keeping WEFT on the air, you're keeping the Prairie Monk program on the air and every other program for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So that's really why we need to hear from you, is without you, there's no, forget about there wouldn't be a Prairie Monk, but there wouldn't be a WEFT. So we really need to hear from just a few people to make pledges. And here's the other thing I remember from when I came on after the Old Timers show. He tended to not get $40 pledges. Now, we will always tell you we would love to get a $40 pledge from you because that's our basic membership level, and it's just like the standard amount. How much you want to give? Oh, let's call it $40. But he would get dozens of $20 pledges and dozens of $10 pledges in the course of a pledge drive. And he would pull in over $1,000 on his show alone. And so that's really important for you to remember is we're not asking for a specific amount. We're just asking for an amount. And you decide what that amount is. You can give us a call. We've got Britta all set to go here, 217-359-9338. But, if you're kind of shy, you don't want to talk to Britta or anyone else here, you can go to our website, weft.org, and make your pledge online there instead. And so I think with that, maybe we can find out what Dave has been thinking about to talk about in his show for today.
Well, I went to a memorial service for Eula Brems, and it was she was an activist, a biodiversity person, a person who loved field trips, would ski and ride bicycles, and she passed, and the memorial service was replete with a lot of people from the natural history area, and it's just amazing that these people get together. Tuesday morning they will go to with the Natural Area Study Group to Collison Marsh to see skunk cabbage. If you haven't seen skunk cabbage, that's the sort of thing you can do. You need to wear boots that are watertight, but it's the sort of place that Eula would have gone to. And amazingly, I sat very close to people who were keeping Eula in well health while she was in declining years, and so we have to respect those people who do that sort of thing. But I was also sitting next to Victor Shelford's granddaughter, and she grew up in Champaign. She's in the Chicago area, but she comes down here fairly regularly, and I think it was exciting we've been talking about Vestal and Shelford and Kendi and Bliss. These are all people who use the prairie that has recently been converted into a trail. And so you have to imagine those people who were the movers and shakers of the Nature Conservancy, which is a worldwide organization to preserve natural history. And so to lose that site that these sorts of people regularly attended, I'm still very much wanting the future phase 2 from St. Joe to Ogden to be a much narrower trail so that we preserve some of the soil and the prairie that's on it. So there was some of that sort of discussion. Some of it went back to people who have been in charge of alternate type education and backup media for school districts, and it's just a wonderful experience, and that is sort of comes out of places like WEFT, and we would hope that you can support that sort of thing. This week we've had a lot of discussion about Heartland Pathways corridors and the instigation of the railroad engineering into Champaign so we can get historic trains in here. It's the sort of stuff that requires knowledge and planning and, in the long run, money, which will spread over many generations, because if you put in a trail, it will stay for a long time. So although the initial expense is high, the overall expense is relatively low, and it's well health, it's biodiversity on either side, it's recreational, it's often historic if you go past a historic elevator, or you go across a river. See, these things happen in the background. I was amazed by the railroad seminar this week. It was a very professional seminar that goes around the country because it is recorded as spoken, and the PowerPoint display probably used 100 pictures, and the topic was the railroads in the Chicago area and how you coordinate them and how you take 12 railroad companies and bring them together and crossings without having accidents, and how you work with the physical plant. And if that can happen at that level, I often wonder why some of that sort of thing can't happen at a state and federal level and an international level to save biodiversity that is going extinct at a tremendously rapid rate. And we hope to try and cool some of that. And coming back to WEFT, you have announcements of happenings that are going on. I have some dates right now. There's a skunk cabbage at Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. You can go to Nita Purvis Center and get a ride. We've been talking about the Sangamon Valley and its use as a canoe corridor. It's used as a riparian corridor for the vegetation on either side. We wonder how it will communicate with other resources like Allerton Park and railroad trails that cross it. It involves cleanup, and they've got some tremendous videos that show people collecting tires and chairs and all manner of junk out of the river. And they will have a meeting at 7 o'clock tomorrow night at the Muhammad Library. And it doesn't look like it's significant if you only have a few people at a meeting, but it's the initiation of an interdisciplinary involvement with people. And so this weekend, Tom Scott and people working with the Champaign, Havana and Western Railroad, which is trying to get the rails into Champaign to bring historic trains there, were having a work day, and it was raining, and there was a few people because it's Easter, and it's a time when students are at home on spring break, so it probably was a fairly small event. But all these things come together, and Sangamon Valley, Upper Sangamon River Conservancy has been doing this sort of thing, and Scott Hayes has been leading that, and I think he's now a member of the Forest Preserve Board. Just an effort that works. It might be someone looking at an uglified Missouri area, Mississippi River, and starting to get people together to pull out old cars and things out of the Mississippi, and then finding that can extend all the way up to Minnesota, with thousands of people doing that sort of thing. So it all starts with little places like the WAFT, and so think of it as we go through our program. There's a few dates that I want to say something about. Ruth Walker passed recently. She was a naturalist, a sculptor. She had a wonderful tree that was sculpted in her front yard. It eventually broke down, but it was like a woman and child made out of a stump of a tree. She had pawpaws, picking up pawpaws, put them in your pocket. A sort of tropical escape plant with rather fruit salad style pawpaws with big seeds in them, so they're not the sort of thing that sells commercially, but they're rather wonderful to taste. So she had a front yard of those sorts of shrubs, and they had drip tips, because they're a sort of plant that has escaped from the tropics, and the drip tip allows rain to drop off. They have an interesting russet sort of flower. It's just right there in her front yard, and so she had possums, and she would care for possums, and so there's a memorial to her at the Channeling Murray Foundation. It will be at 1 to 3:30 on Saturday, the 7th, and it's a sort of time when you get together, and people who may not have seen each other for years do remember Ruth, and they interact with themselves. It's like meeting up with Dr. Shelford's granddaughter, and the fact that someone would even know about Dr. Shelford, but I know about him because I wanted to consider the Danville area with its strip mines, and Dr. Shelford wrote about the ponds, and some of them can be older and younger, and he was studying the biodiversity. So when you have a recent pond and it is got sulfur tailings in it, and it only supports bloodworms, and you have a lot of one creature. But when you leave it for 75 years, then you get a lot of creatures and few of them, and they're balanced, and that sort of ecosystem is there. So that's what makes the Kickapoo Trail possible. And so there was Shelford doing that, but he wasn't only doing that. He was creating an ecological union. We'd had some of the early ecologists. Coles was one in the Indiana area, looking at sand dunes, looking at the change in ecosystem as you came from a lake to wet areas to beaches to the areas beyond the beach, but then sand dunes and the trees like basswoods that have tilias and can grow in the sand and survive. And then behind the sand, a swampland, and then beech maple forest. And so this was an early ecologist. And his daughter, May Watts, was similarly enthralled. So Shelford was bringing together those people. And then eventually Shelford and Kennedy and one of their students, George Fell, got together and they changed it to the Nature Conservancy. And George went off, and we've done a program with George and how he changed natural history conservation, and had a lot to do with the Nature Conservancy, but with chapters that he put together for each state, and then worked with the state to encourage a Nature Preserves Commission, to work with forest preserves and conservation districts, and an institute for research on natural areas, and a person who was not necessarily a doctoral person, but someone who is so dependent on or so knowledgeable in territories that he could corral other people to do things. And so we look for those sorts of people. They're not necessarily going to be whiz-bangs in a specific species or anything like that. They're more like looking at areas that there might be a cemetery or a railroad bed or a little area on a farm field that could not be dug up with a team of 10 horses. So it got preserved, and George and Betts and a whole bunch of others in the Chicago area especially did their best to preserve some of these areas, and in competition with economic development that would look at the soils in these sorts of places. The soils under the prairies are rich glacial material, and it's very easy to use them for a few more rows of corn and soybeans. So we're in competition with commerce, and business is business, and it wants to use resources. And even the early settlers came and would look at the Native Americans and put a fence around a territory and say, then this is mine and you keep off. So the land got distributed for a very low price to entrepreneurs. And now we have to make sure that the entrepreneurs will contribute back to the wee folk, little folk who work with trying to preserve 0.01% of the prairie that is left as a remnant. We need those places. We need the people. We need the people who think about the cultural details, the early settlement, the old elevators, the early settlement, and how do you transmit that to a new generation? And let's be sure the people who are in the coming generation are not going to have anything like the biodiversity that grandparents had or great-grandparents had. We've just been eating it up at a such a rate that we can't afford to do that. The world can't afford to do that. The world can't afford to have things like climate change that are in lockstep with the loss of diversity. And so some of that sort of stuff happens when we do programs with WEFT and put them on television and on YouTube and do a blog or a link that allows you to understand. Sometimes we almost have to pick you up by hand and take you to a prairie because it doesn't look good, folks. It looks like a bunch of weeds. And if you don't know the difference between a prairie and the weeds, then you don't understand it. And so you have to take the people who might help you to preserve that cemetery, prairie, or whatever it is. You have to depend on them providing the money for people to work, to create brochures, to run Prairie State Conservation Coalition meetings, to go to lobby at the state with the Environmental Council, to meet up with you, member, to figure out what a representative can do to preserve a karst topography or something that doesn't look good to the average person who came from Europe, probably with might have been with entrepreneurial skills, but many people who came from England and Ireland and Europe were from a peasant background, so they had to learn what to do with this landscape, and so it sometimes got utilized in a rather raw fashion, and we know that, but we have to say these days, okay, you're producing commodities that are valuable, and you're sending them around the world, but some of that commodity should go back into, some of the wealth from that commodity should go back into the natural areas that we have lost. And once again, it goes back to programs like what we're doing right here and now. And we have to realize that things change, so we have to adapt to media that's like Facebook. And I just was talking to my relatives in Australia, and they're having the same sort of thing happen. At the moment, there's a world lot of apples, so there's a tendency to take out your rather valuable apple orchard and put in canola, or so canola oil is valuable, or grapes. Wine is people who are getting more sophisticated and using wine, so grapes become interesting. It might be for sheep that can be harvested for their very fine wool, or so there's a dynamics here. So you need places like WEFT to change that attitude, to make people aware of it. Even just the little prairie across the road has done a lot of educating of people who didn't really know about their prairie, and they might walk up and down Market Street for years and years and not know it until someone would take them there, or some child would take a grandparent or a parent there, or vice versa, the parent would bring their children. So we need those sort of little niches that make things work. I have a few more dates here I think we ought to let you know about. There's someone from Missouri Gardens will be here at the Forbes meeting. They have a 4 o'clock meeting on Tuesdays, and it usually has these sorts of people. Missouri Gardens is wonderful as a botanical place, and it does things like look at biodiversity around the world and what is changing. One of the things they're doing is collecting seed. And so there will be a specialist who will talk about the seed bank. And the seed bank, you just can't put it on a shelf and hope that it'll survive for 100 years. You have to keep growing it. So seed bank means other things. And that'll be 4 o'clock on Tuesday the 3rd. Grand Prairie Friends is talking about mitigation. Be careful if you're used to going to Grand Prairie Friends meetings. This one is, and I think it's continuing to be, at the Agricultural Extension Office on Country Fair Drive. And so don't go to Anita Purvis Center, but rather end up over in West Champaign, where there's room for quite an audience, and they will be talking about mitigation. Mitigation is how you replace something. If you look at a tree that is 2 feet across, do you put a value on that tree if it has to come out to widen the road? Well, yes. We haven't been very good at that, but it's getting better. If you say that that's a walnut tree, which could be harvested for its veneer and its grain pattern and its seeds, so it's fall on around it, and so is that worth $400 or is it worth $1,000? How do you? So you have to have some experts who have an idea of what the tree is worth. Then you mitigate, which means that if there's a new road, you put probably 25 6-inch or 4-inch or 2-inch trees to replace it. So that's a mitigation. And so how do we mitigate the loss of a prairie? You can never get back that 110 species and the little glitch where you were probably didn't have 110 species. It had probably 25, but it was a niche that was important, and now it's going to be destroyed by a road. How do you say to the planners and the construction people, this is mitigation? We want to replace that tree or that prairie with something similar. So where do you get the seed? Who controls the rules that go with the acquisition of seed? It's always very simple to take a combine to western Kansas and harvest a prairie mechanically, but that's not the prairie of east central Illinois. That has things like June grass and short prairie in it, and it's a different mix. So if you're going to do it in east central Illinois and you're going to harvest that by hand, you're going to spend a lot of human time and energy collecting that seed and processing it and adding a rhizobacteria if it's a legume, and just doing that. That's mitigation, and it's not exactly bringing back that 400-year-old tree, but it's the best we can do, and we need to do that. And so someone who's talking about seed banks and mitigation is important, and that's at the Forbes building in the Natural History Survey area, south of 1st Street and St. Mary's Road, that general area. The Grand Prairie Friends one, which is the mitigation one, is I guess I'm getting mixed up here. The Missouri Gardens one is the one that's at Forbes, and then on the Friday, 6th of April, will be the Grand Prairie Friends mitigation one. There's a genome meeting on the on April 5, I think it is, and it's from 5:30 to 7:30 and I didn't get the details, but I guess it would be in National Center for Computer Solutions. So you might watch that, because you need to know a little bit more about your environment. Just to know that a telomere, which is a bunch of biochemicals on the end of your chromosome, if they're a little longer, you might be around a little longer. And if you're going to live adjacent to a colliery or some other thing that's producing a lot of junk into the river or whatever, that telomere is going to be shorter. So there's research these days to see what telomeres people have when they live close to environmental pollution. So the genome gets at that sort of thing. You're just studying what happens to your telomere when you live in endangered places. There's a Boneyard Festival coming up on the 13th and 14th, so we have we're a vendor, and if you're a vendor, you're a place that supports art, and I think WEFT is probably going to be on the Boneyard Festival, so they're the vendor, and WEFties who do artwork and the like will have a show here on Boneyard Festival time. So we're going to we're hoping for a fine day, and we'll be out there on the Pocket Prairie to ask you what you think about how you could preserve some 30-year-old plants that are pretty big, that have deep roots, sometimes 15 feet down, and how can you take a site that's relatively nicely terraced to include restaurant tables. So we're looking for people who might be able to use their landscaping skills to work with the construction people who seem to be sympathetic. Laurie Coey has been watching this, and she's been writing to the construction people to see if we can't do something to preserve just a little bit of the dignity of the prairie. It's not easy because, like we always say, it looks like weeds, but it's not. It's the progenitors to the flowers and the daisies and the creatures that we have in our gardens. They might be small, they might be perennial rather than annual, they might be not as colorful. But if you put 50 genetic engineers onto these small native plants, then suddenly they become interesting garden plants. And so the progenitors needed to stay there, and it's not just the plants, it's the bumblebee that is losing out to herbicide or losing out to the loss of habitat. So we have a occipiter, a hawk, or that will sit around and look at the urban landscape and find a rat or a mouse or a bird that it can prey on. And so we have around the university some of these birds that have adapted to habitat because they don't have any habitat out there. It's all farmland, and so the habitat we have is in town. So I get questions from people, can I grow a prairie in town? Well, highly unlikely, because if you've been a tree creature, you're going to have shade, and prairie likes very open light. But there are plants that are native that grow in a shady situation. We have to think about whether we're going to plant prairie or we're going to plant forest. If you're in Champaign County, you are 94% prairie. So then, should we be planting prairie rather than planting trees? We can hug a tree, but you really have to think about whether we should replace our 94% prairie with 94% trees. It's not going to happen, of course, but you have to think about what are you going to put in that prairie. We used to have prairie chickens, and their wattles would go up, and their feathers would go up, and they'd do a little dance. And we have people who are Audubon specialists who take off for southern Illinois, where somewhere around by Newton, there's a little crowd of prairie chickens that perform at 3 o'clock in the morning. So you get out there in the blind and you sit and you wait till they start to dance and attract females. And the stronger the dance, the more attractive to the female. Well, we've got down. We used to have thousands of prairie chickens. They eat very well, so people would walk the areas by Fisher and catch those prairie chickens and send them to Chicago for restaurants. And so now we're down to the fact that there's so few prairie chickens that they can't breed. So they've had to bring in prairie chickens from Missouri. And that's a very dangerous thing to do because they're shy birds. And if you pick up a shy bird and put it in a plane and bring it to southern Illinois, it just might die of fright. So how do you preserve something that was a very popular creature at one stage? Do we have a memorial to prairie chickens? Do we take the Upper Sangamon prairie and put in some toy prairie chickens? Perhaps even have a sound effect to go with their activities. A nice plump prairie chicken might be an interesting thing. It would be fun to even have a prairie chicken in actuality. But they're kind of gone. So, okay, so at the Boneyard Festival, we're going to show our little prairie. It'll be early spring, so there won't be much to see. But the site is there, and what can you do with it? And think about Earth Day. It's coming up soon, April the 22nd, Earth Day. And I just want to applaud people who are working with concepts that are beyond the wee folk, little folk. You're talking about $12 million for a trail from Urbana to Danville. You're talking about a bridge that's 100 feet off the ground, and it has to become a bicycle trail, and you have to put prefabricated bicycle trails with fences on them so people won't hurt themselves off that bridge. $2 million. So we have to have some people who are out there going to the city and saying, if we're going to bring a train in from Whiteheath, from the Railroad Museum to Champaign, we're going to have to buy a piece of railroad line in existence that is beyond the 4 miles we're trying to restore to railroad, relaying the rail. That's what was happening on Saturday. Some of this was going on, but you have to have a survey. You have to have materials. You have to know that sometimes you can't always get the same weight of a rail. If you might have a 60-pound rail, a 75-pound rail, a 90-pound rail, or a 130-pound rail, they're different. So you have to have a joiner that allows that to be joined, and two of those cost $100. how do you say, we're going to have to spend $1 million here if we're going to do this, and you have to spread that thought across 100 years that it might be there. That's if we survive climate change and a few other things. So people are talking to people at the city level to see where you would park a train, how could you get a connection between Kickapoo and through behind, in front of the hospital, Carl Clinic, and behind Pravina, or Presence as it's now called, and across to Champaign to park a bicycle next to a historic train between Randolph and State. So that is going on behind the system, and so it means that we have to have some people who go to city meetings, and they're dealing with a lot of things that don't belong to you. So it can be a little boring if you're not involved. So, but we need those people. Often they're women folk who are at home with children, but have a little bit of flexibility to be able to go to a meeting. Or they get it on the web, or they get it from the newspaper. So, enough. I just think going to a railroad seminar means that you meet with engineers. You meet with engineers that have family and have interests. And so I'm talking to an engineer who's also in charge of traffic outside of the Ebert Fests. So people have different avocations, and so getting to know people, whether they're specialists in railroad ballast, or in driving railroad engines, or being engineers with a foot in Boy Scouts, or knowing that Tom Burns, who is a engineer and also a state rep, passed just recently, and that was sad. So getting to know each other and to be a part of the community is rather important. You have worldwide leaders who stand and can tell you what to do, and there's all the peasants that do the doing. But you're hoping that there's a balance between the two, and you do it sometimes locally, and that's why we have places like WEFT, and we have history, and so you need to know a little bit of what happened in the past. So it might be a George Felbert, it might be a Bill Thomas, or a Bill Taylor, or some of those original people who put WEFT together. Okay, I'm using this program as a subterfuge. We're trying to let you know where Heartland Pathways territories are. So we've been making
6 minutes.
Programs using the program we have here. So if you don't know where Heartland Pathways is, that's not very much help. We need to have a brochure. The brochure needs to have a get-you photograph on it. It needs to have one line. It needs to have those sorts of specialists who can bring that sort of thing into action. So we're taking online a field trip so that you will see what some of the problems are as to getting this into action when you don't have the time to go 20 miles out of town to see a Pope Prairie, or an extension of the Pope Prairie to Paxton, or South 45, or Lake Park, or and so we have groups like the Prairie State Conservation Coalition that will send you someone who will work with you to announce a prairie and announce a forest and put it on media so that you can know that forest and enjoy it from your seat in front of a computer. But then you just might get up from your computer and go out and see this thing. And you might take a iPod or a cell phone, and when you get to the spot where there's a stump left of a tree and there's a story about the tree and it's on a moraine, and you're going to get your cell phone out and find out what it looked like in its heyday, and what was its chance to propagate, and why is it there? Is it there just because there's 3 graves of early settlers buried underneath it? So it hasn't been dug up for agriculture. We need that sort of thing, and so we're using this sort of programming to do other things, and so some of you out there, people who have artwork in their background, and you can do these things. So if we want a brochure for a railroad, historic railroad line, we need someone to draw a train in such a way that you'll get to be tickled by its quality, and then you put together that brochure, and then somebody else has to put their hand out to get enough money to pay $300 to have that brochure reproduced. You have to watch whether it is your color picture can go to black and white, because you can reproduce it in black and white for less than if you're doing a color. You need the graphics design people who can do that. But we also need the people who are working with 5-year-olders and 6-year-olders and 8-year-olders that are getting their first contact with nature. And we need you as the adults who come with those people, like we have a seed collecting day at Seymour, and the parents come with their children, and some of the children are very near to just being born, and they come with parents who know those children and can let them see what a little remnant prairie is like. We need all those people, and we hope that you'll help that by contributing to the cause of WEFT and WIL and other groups that do this sort of work and allow you to become the grad student that's going to help to explain that prairie dock or compass plant and why it's accumulating a bunch of organic matter and making an ecological site, and it's called regrowth succession. It's like you started off with a gravel pit and no prairie on it, and it's gradually seeding and it's growing and it's becoming a prairie. And give it 200 years, you'll have a decent prairie. We need someone to explain that to. If you have a work day and you have 50 people, you need a team of people who know at least something. And you'd be amazed. Something is better than once you know a few things about the prairie, and you have a team of children asking you, what is this, what is that, and you'll soon get to know what is that, and then you can be helpful on a day when you have a lot of people arriving, and they're arriving from different countries and different states. Someone from California is not used to seeing what a prairie is. What is it, and how can we belong? We're going to be a part of the university now for a number of years. Tell me what your ecosystem is.
1 minute.
So we're encouraging you to contribute. And I think I'll hand over to David now, and he might say something about the more technical side of WEFT and what you have to do to have a tower and things.
Well, as always, the views and opinions expressed here are those of the speakers only and no one else.